I had a relative one time who lost his compass, and I was just a kid when this was going on, but it was pretty evident even to me and all of us that something was wrong with this member of my extended family. And the patriarch of my family, Grandpa Max Whitman, I remember, pulled this member of the family aside, and later I got wind of what was said. And effectively, what he communicated was, you need to think about your life. You need to think about what you're doing right now and what the implications of that are going to be long-term for a whole lot of people. Likewise, the book of Haggai in the Old Testament has God taking a similar tone through the prophet Haggai toward Zerubbabel and the people who are back in Jerusalem, kind of flirting with rebuilding the temple. Now, big picture here on the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, we are working our way through the book of Matthew. We've been making great progress, maybe not fast progress, but great progress. That's part of the joy of doing a podcast, is we can take our time and dive deep into all kinds of different things. And right now we're in the gap between Matthew 23 and Matthew 24, and the temple is a really important factor in where the story goes from here. So we're diving deep into the Old Testament backstory of the temple. In chapter 1 of the story of the temple, there's this temporary tent called the tabernacle. And when it's set up and ready to go according to God's commands in the distant parts of the Old Testament, God's Spirit shows up and temple-like things happen there. God dwells among his people. Then they build a permanent version of the tabernacle, which is the first temple under Solomon. This is just a little bit after 1000 AD. It's built in Jerusalem. It's huge. Everyone's impressed. The ceremony for dedicating it is a massive success, and God's Spirit, according to the text in both Kings and Chronicles, supernaturally shows up, and God occupies the Holy of Holies in the temple. After that, things go very, very badly. The Assyrians first, and then later the Babylonians come along. They conquer all of the Jewish Israelite people, the Hebrew people, that is, and then there's nothing left. Jerusalem is just left to sit empty between 587 and about 50 years after that. There's just nothing happening in this once great city, and the temple is destroyed. But during that time, the Persians conquer the great and mighty Babylonian Empire, and a guy named Cyrus rises to the top there. Cyrus has a very different foreign policy than his Babylonian predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. His thing is, I'm not sure we can hold down this whole empire through sheer force of will. That didn't work for our predecessors. Let's go let people rebuild their lands, their economies. Let's even let them govern under their own laws so there will be stability. That's going to be cheaper for us as overlords. It's going to be easier to manage. And in a way, this is kind of a forerunner of what the Romans would later attempt, if a little bit more assertive version of it. So Cyrus lets the Jewish people go home, just like Isaiah predicted. Go back, build the temple, do your thing. And so in the late 500s, that's exactly what they do. But when they go back and they get to work on the second temple, at the laying of the foundation, the kids are all excited and pumped, like, we did a big overland road trip and look at how cool it is. But the old people who remember the glory of the old temple are weeping because it pales in comparison to what the old thing was. Eventually, we know that second temple got built, and as we talked about yesterday, where there were pages and pages of explanation about the glory of the dedication of the temple and the arrival of God's Spirit the first time under Solomon, there's only a few sentences set aside in the book of Ezra to describe the dedication here, and there's no reference to God showing up in the same obvious supernatural way. There's no sacrifices that are consumed with fire from heaven. This seems to be a very different animal. But that is not the end of the story of the temple in the Old Testament, because there is an oft-forgotten minor prophet who I just referenced a minute ago named Haggai, who speaks to this whole temple thing. The big question people are wrestling with is, well, where's this all going to go from here? And what about God's promises? And people seem to be kind of preoccupied. If the temple's not going to be that impressive anyway, maybe we should take all that lumber that we got from up in Tyre and Lebanon, and maybe we should use it to make our houses all fancy and stuff, and then we'll get to the temple later. And Haggai, the prophet, speaks into this, and much like my grandpa talking to my extended relative about him not making much sense and needing to rethink his life, so the theme phrase of the very short book of Haggai is, give careful thought to your ways. This is an old man lecture. This is a careful word of warning to the people who had gone back, the returning exiles, who were kind of just poking at rebuilding the temple and seem more interested in rebuilding their own homesteads. And the prophet is saying, you need to read the situation here. The priority needs to be the temple. They'd been sitting idle on it for 15 years at this point. And so the idea is, hey, like this is the point. This is the centerpiece. This is the heartbeat of your hope as a nation for now and for eternity, for all of humanity. Like, let's get after it here. And that's the theme of chapter 1. You get a lot of that firm, well-deserved, think about your ways lecture kind of tone. But chapter 2 gives yet another one of these surprising Old Testament glimmers of hope associated with the temple. The tone of the whole thing pivots, and it goes like this, starting in chapter 2, verse 1 of the book of Haggai, which is being delivered to Zerubbabel, who's the governor of this rebuilding effort in Jerusalem, and all the people who are sort of working with him on the project and sort of more worried about building their own stuff. Haggai 2:1. On the 21st day of the 7th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. Ask them, who of you is left who saw the house in its former glory? Okay, so this is referencing back to the same stuff that Ezra was talking about that we looked at yesterday with the people who saw the old foundations and the old temple, and now they're seeing the beginnings of this little new one. How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? But now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Don't fear. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In a little while, I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and the desired of all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. There is so much there. First of all, did you catch that this is the obscure little passage that Chuck Wesley drew on when he wrote that Come Thou Long Expected Jesus song that sometimes you sing at Christmas, but it's an easy one to forget. But think about it. It's this passage. Listen. Come Thou Long Expected Jesus, born to set thy people free. From our fears and sins release us. Let us find our rest in thee. Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art. You hearing it? Dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart. It's all like that. This is clearly what he was looking at here. And what he's trying to draw on is a promise that nobody in the original audience could picture. They are picturing this huge downer and disappointment. This is a consolation prize. This is nowhere close to the former glory that you enjoyed. But then the text has God turning the tables on them and being like, no, this is the plan all along. You guys are picturing that last building as being the point. You're picturing the national power that came with that as being the point. But somehow this little building is going to be more glorious. Now, some people look back in history and they're like, oh yeah, that prophecy turned out to be true because of Herod the Great. Herod the Great made it bigger right before the time of Jesus. And that biggerness, that is what really, really matters to God here. But you read the whole context of Haggai and the rest of the Old Testament, it doesn't look like bigger is what the whole thing is pointing toward. It looks like completion is what the whole thing is pointing toward. It looks like Matthew 5:17 is what the whole thing is pointing toward. When in the key verse of the book of Matthew, Jesus of Nazareth says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Jesus is the completion of this story that the nations and every human heart and all of the story of history and the whole Old Testament and Bible, everything is yearning for this. Everything is longing for this, and it all points to Jesus. Why is the second temple going to be greater than the first? Well, for one, God is going to take on flesh and go into that temple. He's been present in this other temple, but Jesus, the Son, God in the flesh, is going to be there. And this is in keeping with a theme that we see throughout the Gospels, particularly in Luke. We catch a lot of this language about Jesus affirming people who in the moment seem to understand how absolutely unique this is. When Martha and Mary are having a disagreement about whether it makes more sense to get things tidied up or to sit at Jesus' feet, Jesus affirms like, yeah, this is a pretty unique moment here. When fancy know-it-alls are bent out of shape because somebody's wasting valuable perfume that could have been used to take care of the poor, Jesus sides with the person who wastes the valuable perfume on him, indicating like they get it. Like that person who's burning that perfume on me, they understand this moment. And so the whole Bible seems to testify to this idea that there really is a culminating moment here. And all of these other things, they're birth pangs, they matter, they're important parts of the story, but the payoff of the story, the rhyme, the climax of the story, that's what really matters. And what it's all pointing to is ultimately the point. No, it's out of this second temple and the things that happen there that God's presence is realized. Emmanuel, God with us, happens at that temple on more than one occasion. And it's in and around that temple where all of the things that need to happen in order for Jesus to go to the cross and be resurrected, which is the culminating redemptive event of the entire Bible, the whole story hinges right there. All of that happens either in the shadow of or literally in that second temple. And that doesn't even begin to speak to what the temple means moving forward beyond the New Testament, which is another conversation we'll have to get to later. No, the reason that Charles Wesley fixated on this little obscure passage in Haggai chapter 2 and made a famous Christmas song about it, the reason we sing that song around Christmas time is an affirmation of what God is saying through the prophet to Zerubbabel at this time, which is, look forward. The bigger thing is still to come. You are thinking in terms of wonders of the world and grandeur and politics and defeating enemies and all that's great. Clearly, God's hand was on this situation to help them experience a degree of independence and to rebuild this thing. And that's awesome. But there is a greater and bigger thing coming. And that greater and bigger thing is going to happen in and around this temple. But also Jesus is going to liken himself to the temple in a greater way. And in that sense, it's just one more place where Jesus is the new and greater version of the thing that was a big deal and important in the Old Testament, but that culminates in who he is. So the temple itself then is, a story of former glory that is lost in destruction, and some glory regained as something of a consolation, but also there's disappointment. But also the story of the temple includes this promise, this optimism that says this thing is not done, and the glory of this present house, this is the second temple that was being built in the 5th century, will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And what we're looking at in Matthew right now is the answer to the question that anybody who read Haggai at the time would be asking, and that is, well, how? How's that going to play out? How's it going to work? And the answer is God become man, God in the flesh, Jesus of Nazareth. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.